Welcome, David, or Sir David. Do we have to call you Sir? Or can we just go with David?
David, of course.
Okay. Anyway, thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us, David. The occasion, of course, is the second edition of our book, An Introduction to Statistical Learning, with Gareth James and Daniela Witten. We've added some new chapters, including one on survival analysis. So since you're one of the founders of survival analysis, we thought it'd be fun to have a conversation with you and to talk about your seminal 1972 paper on the proportional hazards model. Of course, you've made enormous contributions to statistics over the last 70 years, and we could spend days or weeks talking about your work, but today we'll just start off talking about survival analysis. Actually, on a personal note, I've known you for a long time. As a graduate student at the University of Toronto, you were a co-author with David Andrews, and you visited Toronto a few times, and I got to know you then. And then in 1984, you won't remember this, but at the American Statistical Association annual meeting, I gave a talk, one of my first talks as a graduating student. Unfortunately, the talk was on the last afternoon of the last day of the conference, which meant almost everyone had gone home. And the talk was on the Cox model, on an extension of the Cox model. It was in an enormous ballroom, which probably would have held 500 people, but at that point, there were about 15 people in the audience. So I was quite disappointed. And then as I started to talk, I looked in the back of the room, and you walked into the room, which made me extremely nervous that David Cox was going to hear a talk by me on the Cox model. But I managed to get through. Yeah, I managed to get through it, and we all left to go to the bus stop. And you very nicely said to me, "Good talk, Mr. Tibshirani," which meant a lot to me. And I'll never forget that, how kind you were to a lowly graduate student who was very nervous during his first talk. So that's many years later. Now we'd like to talk to you about your survival analysis work. Maybe starting with leading up to the 1972 paper. How did you become interested in survival analysis? What motivated you in that early paper?
Well, I first learned about survival analysis 30 years before that. Towards the end of the Second World War, I was sent to work at a place called the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Department of Mechanical and Structural Engineering, and they were about the basic ideas of survival analysis because they were interested in things like wings breaking off aircraft when they encountered turbulence and such like. So the basic ideas of survival analysis I gradually learned about, first in this aeronautical context, strength of materials, and then from there to a place called the Wool Industries Research Association, which is basically a semi-government organization concerned with research in the textile industries, in the wool textile industries. It's plural because there are at least 2 or 3 different wool industries. Mm-hmm. And of course, strength of materials was crucial in that, the wear of fabric in particular. So I remember experiments on the wear of carpets, for example. One would put down carpets made in slightly different ways and measure after a certain length of time, how much fiber had been worn out off the carpet.
Yes.
This, if you did this directly, 30 years to get a reasonable amount of data. Mm-hmm. So it was on an accelerated life basis of putting the carpet made of different ways in a busy railway or railroad station where hundreds or thousands of people would trample over the carpet per day. And then you get a result in 2 weeks, perhaps, or so. So there was considerable interest then in accelerated life models. And I'm talking now about before 1950, accelerated life models, notably the Weibull distribution and exponential distribution. These were the two distributions that primarily used to analyze that data. There'd been very important theoretical work much earlier by R.A. Fisher that arose out of textile physics. A man in the cotton industry called Tippett asked Fisher about the limiting distribution of extreme values because Tippett was interested in extremes as giving the strength of cotton yarn. And Fisher showed in his characteristic way that there were 3 possible limiting distributions you could get. Characteristic way, in other words, there was no issue. It wasn't really a proof. It was just a very convincing argument that there were just these 3 limiting distributions. And he all showed that they were approached very slowly. The limiting process could be very, very slow. And that line of work was brought to an end by the Russian probabilist Boris Nedenko 10 years later when Nedenko proved a theorem. Nedenko was undoubtedly attached in some way to Kolmogorov, taking up an interest in this. So there's a whole line of work in the strengths of materials based on the idea that strengths are about the minimum of something. And some of this, as I said, was probabilistic, but much of it was statistical. But when it came to an application, largely based either on the exponential distribution or the Weibull distribution. Now, I'd worked on things like this since quite a long time, before 1972. But in the late 1960s, the clinical trial people started to take an active interest in this. And they wanted a general regression model, but they didn't want to assume, they didn't like exponential distributions, and they didn't want to assume Weibull distributions either. So out of that, discussions with various people, John Tukey was the most prominent probably, but not them. But there were quite a number of others, Peter Armitage particularly. The idea of the semi-parametric proportional hazard model came up. How was it going to be analysed? And then somehow, I don't quite recall how, it was one of these things that suddenly came to me. The thing to do was to write down the likelihood in a particular way and throw most of it away and work with the rest. And that this was a statistically valid thing to do. So that led to the 1972 paper.
Now, you haven't mentioned the work of Mantel-Hansel earlier. Was that also an influence?
Mantel and Hansel was discrete.
Right. But I was wondering whether that line of argument helped.
Yeah, I know I don't want to sound... Mantel and Hansel, 30 pages to produce their test. And I had given the test in the same year in half a page. Yes, but Mantel-Hansel was discrete, whereas this was continuous. And it was all quite intuitive, the notion that in all these time points in which nothing happened, there was no information to compare the treatments or whatever. And so throw that rubbish away. It was a rather intuitive thing, made more mathematically secure in a paper in Biometrica about 5 or 6 years later that I wrote, which in a way is a better paper, a technically better paper than the 1972 paper.
So David, that paper has become so famous. At the time you wrote it, did you have an idea that was going to be a big breakthrough?
No, I thought it was answering a question that, in the sense that 4 or 5 different people, some American, some British, 5 or 6 different people had all said, this is an important paper problem that we want solved. So in the sense that I'd done that, I felt something had been achieved, but how important it was, well, who's no idea really. It's somewhat of a fluke, an issue of timing, that it happens to get so much attention.
Well, as you look back at it now, you've written over 300 papers. Now, is it a paper that one of the papers you're the most proud of?
It's the most.
Is it one of your papers that you are very proud of now, looking back after 50 years?
Ooh. I think I'm pleased if it helped people analyze data well. I'm very, very happy. Let's put it like that. Pride, I wouldn't want to use the word.
David, when I first went to graduate school, I knew that you were the editor of Biometrica and had been editor for a long time. And I just looked up recently and I saw that you were in fact editor for 25 years. And you succeeded the 2 Pearsons, Carl Pearson and Egan Pearson. And you were the 3rd editor from 1966 on for 25 years. And you had the reputation of being the gatekeeper. So you screened the papers, and if they didn't pass your test, they were sent back to the authors. Did you enjoy that role as editor of Biometrica?
Enjoy isn't the word I would normally use about it. It was all work. But extremely interesting because it forced me to at least look at an enormous range of material. And from that point of view, although it was the screening part of the papers, it was a lot of work, but it was also very, very informative as to what was going on a fairly broad front. And it had fantastically efficient assistant, well, she wasn't called assistant editor, but a person who was doing the administration. Well, that helped enormously. But it was something like 400 papers a year, of which 200 clearly had to be refereed. And so I was using a referee or so. I don't think I used associate editors very much, actually. But there were referees who were used a lot. So for perhaps a quarter of the papers clearly had to be refereed. A quarter of them were either so bad or on such a so medical or not on, or perhaps extremely interesting, but not on the right sort of subject. So something like a quarter of them could be rejected in a few minutes, just a quick. And then there were the more difficult ones that were in between. Because I worked on the idea, which I think the people would, if the paper's going to be rejected, people would rather be told straight away than have to wait 6 months for a report that doesn't actually say anything. So I did try and avoid the latter. I don't suppose I did entirely, but
well, I think it has been regarded as a great service to the community, because if a paper got through, it was good enough for David Cox, it was good enough for the rest of us. I think that was the general consensus.
I think you might be exaggerating something.
And it's also hard to imagine anyone being able to do that today with the volume of papers that are produced.
Well, 400 papers a year when you're publishing 100. Would it be many more? I don't think it's any more now.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I might be wrong.
Even 400 sounds like a frightening number to me.
Oh, it is a frightening number.
Yeah.
So many a day, including Saturdays and Sundays and bank holidays and goodness knows what.
The motivation for your 1972 paper was in application, as you mentioned, in the textile industry.
Well, no. That was how I was interested in the whole field of survival analysis. The motivation for the 1972 paper came from questions from medical statisticians, mostly.
The point I was making, it seems that your motivation for this work and a lot of your other work is in applications as opposed to theory, to mathematics. Is that a fair statement, that you tend to be motivated by real applications rather than theoretical considerations?
Very interesting and difficult question. I think I was motivated by finding it interesting and feeling there was some small possibility that I might be able to make a contribution to the subject, because there are subjects that I would find very, very interesting, but which are so technical or specialized that it would be very difficult to enter them. But my later work, for example, with Barndorf Nielsen, the Danish statistician, that's much more theoretical. That wasn't motivated by applications, but by trying to produce a coherent theory.
David, in 2003, you went to South Africa, where they had, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of their Statistical Association, and I was there as well. And
very well, thank you. You helped make it a very interesting time.
And the thing that struck me was there were lots of all the senior statisticians in South Africa clamoring around to talk with you, but you found the time to go and visit the student poster sessions and talk to the students. And that struck me as being part of your personality. And so have you enjoyed talking to and working with students in your career?
In the great, great, great majority of cases, yes.
Not always. I see. Okay.
Just occasionally. Not often. And very rarely in the UK or most of the United States. But just wherever you go, there'll be the occasional difficult person, unfortunately. But no, I've enjoyed it.
Well, maybe we can talk a bit now about the future. I mean, statistics now is very different from the 1972. I mean, as you know, there's a huge amount of data available now. Computation has completely changed the field. What is your view of how things are going in statistics and in the future? And of course, if you have concerns, please tell us, because we'd love to hear your wisdom about the future.
Well, I don't have one. I mean, I'm puzzled. It seems to me the notion that you just have a lot of data, so what? You've got to have some intelligent questions to ask about it. Have some purpose to it. And much of it seems, well, we have this massive data. So what? We just forgotten even the term they tend to use, but use methods that I can't quite see what scientific enlightenment they're going to produce in most cases. I'm sure that there are individual instances, but if you don't have an interesting and searching question to begin with, what's the chance of getting an interesting and searching answer? And of course, you could say there's a lot of increased interest in causality. Well, I'm not. There is that much increased. It's that the word is used very much more widely than it used to. Well, I'm thinking back to almost the second job I had in the textile industry. I was working with a very good applied physicist in the first draft of a section of our paper, and had put something or other causes something. And this applied physicist had said, no, respectable scientists don't use that word. It's got too much philosophical overtones to it. Just say is strongly related to, and the interpretation is so-and-so.
Well, David, our time is up. It's been wonderful having you in this conversation, and thank you very much for joining us here today and sharing your thoughts with us. And just congratulations on an incredibly wonderful career.
Well, thank you very much indeed for the interesting chat.
Yeah. Thank you, David.
Good luck to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Write some more good papers, of course.
You should write some more good papers too.
Oh, I'm trying. It's rather slow though at my age.
It's slow at our age. Forget about your age.
Come up with. Well, anyway, pleasure to know you both. Good luck.
You too. Thank you, David.
Goodbye, David. Best wishes.
Bye.